Thank you so much, Dinyaka. I'm really excited to join everyone today. I'm really grateful for the invitation, and yeah, really grateful to have this discussion today. So before I begin, just a little bit about myself. I'm Thato, as Dinyaka mentioned. I currently work at Uber for Business, where I am the territory manager for South Africa. And I also run Women at Uber for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which is essentially where we really push gender diversity initiatives and ensure that there's equity and inclusion. But prior to Uber, I actually had quite an interesting career. I was a management consultant, and I started out at McKinsey & Company and worked around the world, particularly in the digital consulting space. And so I worked across East Africa, Australia, a little bit of Europe, and as well as Singapore. And that was quite a bit of fun. It was really an exciting time. And then following that, I transitioned to Discovery, where I worked within Discovery Vitality, which, as many of you know, it's a behavioral wellness program focused on driving behavioral outcomes and changing people's health behaviors. I then moved on to Life Healthcare, where I was doing a lot of the digital health initiatives within the business, and then finally now to Uber. But what's critical about my journey is that throughout these stages, right from university through to an internship in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank, I have been heavily involved in initiatives focused on gender, diversity, inclusion, and all these pieces. And I founded a society at University of Cape Town called Young Women Professionals, which at the time we had identified that a lot of young women with a lot of potential leaving university were not getting access to some of these really high-profile, high-octane roles, such as high-octane roles such as investment banking or consulting, and we wanted to create the platform and help people get access to these fantastic postgrad opportunities. Then I did an internship at the World Bank in DC, where I worked at the Gender Secretariat, and there the focus was really about how do we think about improving gender equity and diversity, particularly in developing nations and particularly economically. So one interesting piece of work that we did was focus on how do we help particularly women on the rest of the continent where there may not be strong property rights or business rights. How do we actually help these women get access to this critical information so that they can run their own businesses and they can prosper, particularly if they're widows or single women. I then joined McKinsey, as I mentioned, and I did a lot of work on women at McKinsey. And there the focus was really on building up robust research that spoke about how do women make it through ranks in the workplace, and how can companies better support women and what can women do. And then transitioned to Discovery, where at the time I was running some analysis on what is actually happening in the business that prevents women from moving up to very senior ranks, and what can the business do to support. And then finally now at Uber, I'm running initiatives across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm going to share my screen just to share my presentation. And I think my lessons throughout my journey, which is what I'll speak about today, is that we have done a good job driving initiatives that focus on empowering and supporting women. So, Venetia spoke really well about some of them. How do you network? How do you position yourself in your career? What are the critical skills that you need to have? And how do you move forward and progress so that you can move into either more senior ranks or towards work that you're more passionate about, or as in your journey as an entrepreneur? And I think those things are very important because for a long time, women were not at the table. So it's very difficult to get a seat at that table without knowing some of the rules and learning what it takes to get there. And I think that's a good thing, and we've made a lot of progress. However, I think where the future is heading and where we must head is that we must hold organizations accountable for driving gender equity initiatives. And this is what my presentation will be about today. Super. So as I shared, my journey in gender equity so far has focused on initiatives targeted at empowering women, and I mentioned some of these before. And when we look at the landscape of what we're doing around gender equity, across the continent and across the world, this is consistent of what we see. We're seeing really inspiring panel discussions where women can be motivated by people they look up to. We're seeing, really incredible professional development events. We're seeing networking. We're seeing how to progress through the ranks. We're seeing things such as gravitas training across the board, and these things are important. And as I mentioned, while these initiatives are a fantastic start, structural change is needed. And this is a case study just from Unilever around this particular point and how they actually reached gender parity. So in 2010, Unilever looked like many other organizations around the world. There were about 27% women in management positions, and they decided that this is something that needed to change. And so what they've done over time, what they did over time was look at real key structural change that was needed, because prior to 2010, they were very much focused on the panel discussions, the networking, and all these tools that we use to help women progress in their careers, and not so much on looking at the inside and saying, as an organization, structurally, how do we hold ourselves accountable and really drive change? And this is a key component for if we see change. Recently, Melinda Gates announced that should the world continue as it is, it will take about 100 years to get to gender parity in the workplace and in entrepreneurship. It will take 100 years. With all the work that we're doing today, with all the efforts we're putting in, with all the attention the topic is getting, the way things are going, it will take 100 years. And that's just not good enough. And so it requires organizations and governments to really think about structurally how you can get this done. And so Unilever started that process in 2010, and recently, just before COVID, they actually announced that this year they'd hit their target of gender parity in management roles. So it's completely 50-50 around the world in management roles at Unilever. So applause to Unilever. And so I wanted to take out some insights from what they've done and share around some perspectives about what companies can do. And this is something in my role at Women at Uber, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, is that it's a complete focus area. We've realized that we can give women all the tools they need, but if the structures aren't allowing them to progress accurately or properly, then we really do rob them of an opportunity. And so the first thing that Unilever did that was really, really strong was that they led from the top. And so what happened is that they created a global diversity board that was chaired by the CEO. And here it's critical that it was the CEO and not a junior level executive who was chairing this board, because it speaks to the seriousness of it. And the CEO is of course a man. And so again, reinforces the idea that men are part of the solution in these organizations. All the main executives sat on this board, and very interestingly, as part of the performance targets, which obviously included finance targets, obviously included safety targets and the like that they have in companies like Unilever, they set agenda targets. And they said every business unit and every executive will be assessed on how well they meet gender targets within their BU and how they're progressing over time. And so raising it to that profile of the high decision makers in a global organization was really, really critical, and I think was one of the key aspects that drove gender change. The second piece was around rallying the company. Very often organizations will form D&I committees or D&I initiatives or D&I projects that will comprise of a few people in the organization who are passionate about this and want to drive it forward. However, what Unilever did differently is that they rallied the entire company behind this cause. And so there were more than 100 diversity champions appointed to drive the cause, and it consisted of both men and women, once again, to reinforce the idea that it requires male allyship. And what this does is that it really creates momentum in the organization and a bit of a hype as these diversity champions, were tasked with various tasks, spreading the word and really driving that message forward. The third thing they did is that they spread the message. And so many of us know that Unilever is a fantastic FMCG company with fantastic advertising. And so they leveraged that power to drive that internal message home around creating really strong, well thought out internal initiatives and campaigns that challenged outdated stereotypes about gender. So one great example is that there was a campaign about, women can't be in supply chain, because obviously they work a lot in factories, they create soap and products and the like. And so the factory work, people are typically saying, oh no, this is a man's work, and the marketing and the branding work is women's work. And so they challenge these by creating really, really compelling campaigns and ads to really challenge people within the workplace around how they're thinking about their own roles and the roles of their colleagues, men and women within the organization. The fourth thing that they did, which I think was brilliant, is that oftentimes people have bias, and we often talk about unconscious bias because sometimes people are just not aware of this particular issue. And what they did is essentially created a gender appointment ratio, and they worked in conjunction with Harvard University, an esteemed professor there, who helped them think about how do they tackle this quite scientifically. And one initiative that they brought up was that they created a ratio which measured how many women were hired in relation to men per executive and per BU. So every executive, every senior manager actually was able to track their own unconscious bias that actually 80% of the hires I ever make at a certain level are only men. Why is that? Or my ratios particularly, or managers who had more balanced ratios were applauded and celebrated, and they were asked to kind of share their experiences. So I think limiting unconscious bias, bringing that to the fore, and again, putting out the data to hold senior leadership accountable was really, really critical. And then lastly, and a very important point, which I think has made, particularly in COVID, has become much, much more at the forefront, is around flexibility. And how do you think about policies for working parents? In the past, and still in many, many companies today, it's very focused on maternity leave, the standard 4 month to 4.5 month period. You come back into the thick of things. And a lot of working mothers have expressed that once they do come back to work, they don't feel that their career moves as quickly, or they're taken care of, or they're allowed flexibility as much as their male counterparts. And so what Unilever did to even the playing field is that they introduced a global paternal leave policy, as well as adoption leave for same-sex couples, which is critical because it essentially brought to the fore that men are as equal caregivers as women, as mothers are, and it was important to highlight that. And then flexible work was formalized as a policy. They did something quite brave in this respect because they have a global role called Global VP of R&D Strategy and I think Operations. And this role is the first role probably in a Fortune 500 company that is actually shared by 2 people. So it's one title and it's shared by 2 people, 2 women. And both of these women work 3 days a week and they manage separate global teams. But they share this singular title, and it allows them to work for 3 days a week, and the rest they can spend with their families. And formalizing this, making it the norm, has proved to be very powerful because it's given people really the space to work how and if they want, particularly if they have a family arrangement. And so this was my very short overview of this piece, because I think many of us are only starting to think about this and really drive the point home around what would it really take to accelerate diversity in spaces so that every one of the women on this call, whether you're in university or in school, early in your career, mid-career, or latter part of your career, that with all the work we're doing, all the workshops we're attending, all the growth that we're going through, all the extra lessons we're taking, all the extra initiatives we're doing to enable us professionally, to ensure that the workplaces and the organizations that we do find ourselves in are also meeting us halfway and are really focused on changing the structural barriers that result in women being maybe moving a bit slower through the professional ranks, and holding these organizations accountable. And I think what COVID has taught us is that it'll become incredibly important that companies are flexible, companies make space. And I think that employees and people will continuously and increasingly hold companies accountable to making a change, because it cannot just be one-sided, and we all have to come along for the ride.